9. Winter descended suddenly with bone-chilling cold. The damp, raw wind swept in from the ocean and entered through cracks in the walls of the hut. It made the fire flicker and hiss. Claire wore a thick furred vest that Alice had stitched for her from an animal hide, and warm boots from the same hide laced with sinew. She accompanied Alice one morning to Breen's cottage, where the baby girl, now named Ellen, was swaddled in layers of woven cloth and warmed in her cradle by wrapped stones made hot in the fire. Alice chuckled after listening to the shrill cry of the infant. "Summer babies fare better," she told Breen, "but this one sounds to be strong." Breen poured tea into thick mugs. Outside the wind blew, and on the floor near the fire little Bethan, humming tunelessly, sorted the acorns into families. Claire excused herself and slipped away. Outside, she wrapped her shawl tightly over the fur vest and pulled her thick knitted head down to protect her ears. She started up the hill, following the deserted path as it wound among the wind-tossed trees. No one was about. The cold weather was keeping people indoors. But perhaps, she thought, Einar would be in the meadow, tending his creatures, and would welcome her company. Climbing, she held her mittened hands to her mouth and breathed into them for warmth. Her feet slipped now and then on mud frozen to ice. It was hard for Claire to understand seasons. Her returning memory had told her nothing of the way the leaves in summer showed their undersides as a storm approached, then withered and dropped when the nights were chill. Now there was the cold, and she could not remember it. She had never had a coat before, or a shawl, she was sure of that. And rain, it had been new to her in summer. And now, with the cold, it was mixed with spits of ice, and who was to guess what might follow? Each day came as a surprise, though Alice, realizing, tried to prepare her and explain. Claire knocked at the door of the wood-slattered shed where lame Einar lived, but there was no answer. She pushed the door open, peeked in, and saw that the ashes of his fire were still hot. Wisps of smoke drifted from the chimney and disappeared with the wind into the gray sky. He would be up in the field, she knew. She closed the door tight, pulled her shawl closer around her, and climbed the path. She found him rubbing salves into the leg of a sheep that had caught itself in a thorny bush. "Here, help hold him still, would you? He keeps pulling away." Claire wrapped her arms around the neck of the impatient creature and tried to soothe him by murmuring meaningless sounds. "Shh, shh," she said, as she had heard Bryn whisper to the baby when she cried. She leaned her head against the matted fleece of the sheep's neck. It felt like a pillow, though its smell was strong. There, Einar released the leg, and the sheep shook itself and pulled loose from Claire's grasp. It bounded away through the high, dry grass, and she could hear the nasal bleats of greeting from its flock. He looked at her and said, "You're cold." Claire laughed at him because he had said the obvious. She was shivering and breathing again into her own cupped, mittened hands. "Come down to my shed," he told her. He looked out over the flock, saw that they were huddled together, heads hunched low, out of the sleet. Then he went down the path and she followed. She sat on the heap of skins that he used for sleeping while he poked the ashes into a red glow and then added a thick piece of oak branch. She could feel the warmth expand. "Tell me why you've come out on a foul day like this," he asked her. She hesitated, uncertain how he would react. Finally, she said carefully, "They tell me you climbed out once." He glanced over, then turned back to the fire and rearranged it a bit, though it seemed to Claire unnecessary. She thought that perhaps he simply needed to look away. I did," he acknowledged. "Do you want to know the why of it?" "The how. I want to know the how. I look at the cliff and it looms there, unclimbable." Einar sighed. He rose with an effort from where he knelt on the ground. then moved over to sit beside her on the skins. They both stared at the fire. "I best tell you the why first, so you understand." Claire nodded, knowing she would need to tell him her own why when the time came. Spatters of sleet tapped against the roof of the shed, but they were warm inside. "I never knew my mom," he began. "She died when she birthed me. Alice came," they said, "and helped, but I was big and she labored too long and bled, and she died. It happens sometimes." Claire nodded. Alice told her that it did. She remembered how interested Alice had been, hearing her tell her own story of the cutting. "It'd be different here," Alice had said. "My father was a fisherman, and he was out with the boats. It was this time of year, with the cold and the wind. He likely had a bad time of it too. But he was a hard man, my father. Strong, used to the weather." He shrugged. "As I am," he added. "But you're not hard, Einar." "Hardened to the weather, I am. I must be for the creatures." She knew he meant his flock of sheep. "I don't feel the cold as you do," he told her. "You've always been here. You've learned to live with it." They sat silently for a moment. Then he began again to talk. "They say he came in from the sea that evening and emptied his nets and tied his boat. All who saw him fell silent, for no one wanted to be the one to tell him that his son was birthed healthy, but his wife was already stiffening and being readied for a coffin. He looked away. Then he said, "They say he had wanted a son, but not the one what took his wife." Outside, a branch broke in the wind, skittered across the dooryard of his shed, and slammed against the wall. Claire could picture the fisherman arriving home in weather just like this to find a squalling infant and a wife turned blue and lost. "It was Alice kept him from flinging me into the fire. Others came and held him down. He roared into the night, they say, cursing all flesh and the wind and the gods, even cursing the sea that be his livelihood. He was a hard man to start, they say. My mom, she softened him a bit, but when she was gone, he turned to stone. And the stone had an edge to it, sharpened against me, for I had killed her." "But it wasn't," Claire began, then stopped. He hadn't heard her. "Others raised me, village women. Then, when I was old enough, he took me back, said it was time for me to pay for what I'd done." What did that mean, old enough? How old were you? He thought. 6 years, mayhap. My front teeth had fallen out. She shuddered at the thought of a little boy expected to atone for his mother's death. "I didn't know him. It was as if a stranger took me. I went to his cottage, for they said I must, and that night he gave me food and drink, and a blanket to wrap around me as I slept on a pile of straw. In the morning he kicked me awake before it was light, and told me he would make a fisherman of me, for I owed him. After that, every day, until I was growed, I went with him to the boat, and on the boat out onto the sea. He never spoke a soft word, never told me about the kinds of leaves or creatures, or pointed to the stars in the sky, never sang a song to me, or held my hand, just kicked me across the deck if I be clumsy, laughed when I be twisted in the ropes and sliding pure froze in the water that washed aboard, slapped me in the head when the sea was rough and I puked over the side. He hoped I would wash overboard and drown. He told me that. He made me climb the mast to untangle the lines, and he laughed when my hand slid from the salty wood and I fell onto the deck. When I broke my arm, he kept me on the sea all day, hauling nets, then sent me to Alice that night and told her to have it fixed by morning or he'd break the other. You should have killed him, Claire said in a low voice. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, I had already killed my mother. He stood suddenly, leaning on his stick. He went to the door, cracked it open, and breathed the wind. She was afraid he was going to go out into the bitter cold, that telling her his past had now forced him to punish himself in some way. But after a moment, he pulled the door tightly closed and came back. He sat down again, leaning his stick against the wall, and took several deep breaths. I growed very strong, he said. I know. I growed taller than my father, and so strong, I could have picked him up and flung him into the sea. But I never thought to do that. I stayed silent. I obeyed him. I cooked for him like a wife, and washed his clothes, and was a wife in other ways too terrible to mention. I made myself into stone. I willed myself deaf when he cursed me, and blind to the look of hatred in his eyes. I waited. Waited for what? To be old enough, strong enough, brave enough, to leave, to climb out. What went wrong? She asked him. Not in the climbing out. I trained for it. I was ready. I knew I could do it, and I did. It went wrong after. Einar moved one damaged foot slightly, staring at it. His tone was bitter. Then it changed and became more gentle and curious. Why do you be asking about this? I must try, Claire told him. I must try to climb out. He stared at her. No woman ever done so, he said. I must. I have a child out there. A son. I must find him. She had known he wouldn't be scornful, for that was not his nature. She had thought, though, that he might laugh at the impossibility of her plan, but he did not, and she realized that he already knew of the child, that he had heard the talk of it. He looked at her thoughtfully for a moment, then said, Push against this. He extended his arm toward her, his hand held out upright, as if to shove something away. Like this? Claire held her hand up against his. He nodded. Push. She did, summoning her strength to try to move his hand, to bend his arm. It was firm, rigid, immobile. Her own arm trembled with her effort. Finally, she gave up. Her hand dropped back into her lap. It ached. Einar nodded. You're strong, at least in the arms. Can you climb? Claire pictured the vertical rock cliff that hung over the village and hid the sun for half the day. She shook her head. I climb path up to the meadow where you keep the sheep. You've seen me do it often enough. And sometimes, gathering herbs, I go up into the woods near the waterfall. I never get tired. And it's steep there, but I know that's not what you mean. You must start to harden yourself. I'll show. It won't be easy. You must want it. I do want it, Claire said. Her voice broke. I want him. Einar paused and thought, then said, It'd be better, I think, to climb out in search of something, instead of hating what you're leaving. It'll be a long time, he told her, to make you ready. I know. Not days or weeks, he said. I know. Mayhap it will take years, he told her. For me, it was years. Years? He nodded. How do I start? Claire asked. 10. Einar says I must do this every single day. It strengthens my belly, where the scar is. Watch. Alice glanced over from the fire, where she was stirring a pot of onion soup. She watched for a moment as Claire, lying on the floor of the hut, wedged her feet under a slab of rock that jutted from the base of the wall, and then lifted the upper half of her body and held herself as a slant taut for a moment before she lowered herself slowly back down and took a breath. Surely you didn't show that lad your scars? Of course not, but I told him of it. Claire bit her lip, held her breath, and raised herself once again. Then down slowly, and again. There, she said, gasping after a few moments. That's 10. He told me to do it 10 times every day. Here, have some soup and bread now, Alice told her. I'll start bottling some strengthening brews for you as well. She glanced up at the dried herbs hanging from the beams that supported the hut's roof. Claire could hear her murmuring the names: white willow, nettle, meadowsweet, golden seal, and knew she was pondering what combinations to create. She had told Alice of her plan. No one else knew. Claire thought of Alice as the calmest person she knew, the person who had seen the worst of things over her long life and was not surprised or distressed by any of it anymore. Claire had watched her stitch the flesh and wrap in the stringent poultice around the leg of a small child gashed by a fall on the slippery rocks, soothing both the terrified mother and the screaming toddler at the same time with her reassuring voice. She had seen her, quiet and commanding, attend the most difficult birth, with the babies upside down or sideways, and the mom begging for death and the dad puking in the dooryard. Claire had been there at death, and Russ's mother from fever and cough, a fisherman with his skull crushed by a broken mast, a young boy racked by fits from the day of his birth, finally at 5 dead with foam on his lips and his eyes rolled back to white. Alice had tended them, tended their families, weighted the eyelids and folded the arms, then returned to the hut to wash her tools, cook supper, and wait for the next frantic villager who would come to the door begging for help. She had never seemed alarmed until the day Einar and Claire told her that Claire must climb out. That cannot be, she had said loudly, and began to rock back and forth in her chair as if to try to soothe a deep pain. Oh no, cannot. You'll die. She turned to Claire fiercely. You'll die on the cliff. You'll fall and be broken to pieces. I've seen the others who was. And look at him, who was once fleet and sure-footed. Look at him now, ruined by climbing out. I'm sorry, Einar. You're a good lad, and I loved your mom, but you're bloody ruined by that mountain, and I won't have you do it to my girl. It was not the mountain ruined me, Alice, Einar said firmly. Claire, listening, was startled by the sudden sureness of him. He had always been so shy and halting in his speech. But now he spoke with certainty to Alice. I strengthened myself for it and did it. I climbed out. It was after. And I'll teach her of that. But for now, I'll make her strong. That's how we're starting. And we need you to help Alice, for she wants her son and must have a way to find him. Boat, Alice wailed. She can go forth on the sea, surely, if she must go. No, not by sea. I won't. As much as she feared the cliff and the climbing she must learn to do, Claire feared the sea more. It's winter now, Alice said to them, weakening a bit. Mayhap in spring we can toughen her up, the sun and air. That'll be good for strength. Einar laughed. We'll start now, Alice, he said, and spring will come before we know it. It always does. It did. Spring came. Through all the months of winter she had, each day, lain on the hot floor, put her hands behind her head, and raised herself. Her scarred abdomen had become tight and smooth, and she no longer breathed hard at the effort. She told Einar, I'm ready. He laughed. They were standing beside the door of the hut, and he told her to run up the hillside path, up to the waterfall, and back down to where he stood. There was a fine rain falling, as there had been all week. The path was sleek with spring mud. Claire made a face. It's too slippery. It's smooth and dry if you think on it compared to the mountain. Yes, well, run a bit, grip with your feet. Claire looked down at her own feet, encased in thick wool socks under her coarse leathered sandals. Take them off, Einar said. Claire sighed and obeyed. She pulled her sandals off and the socks. The ground was very cold still. Spring was young and the drizzle was chilly. She wriggled her toes into the cold, wet earth to get the grip and then began to run. The path steepened part way up and she slipped, scraping her knee on a rock. She righted herself, and now her hands were thick with mud and a red trickle of blood patterned her leg. Catching her breath, she eyed the wet path above. Then she took a breath and continued. Run, Einar had said. She had climbed this path often before, but always slowly, placing her feet carefully. Now she ran. She tried to dig her toes into the ground, but they slid and she fell again, and righted herself again. By the time she reached the top of the hill and stood by the rushing waterfall, she found herself in tears. She was coated in mud, shaking with cold, and her knees were swollen and sore. From where she stood, she could see him below, looking up, watching her. She hoped he couldn't see her crying. Now down, she heard him call. Sliding part way, grasping tree roots to keep from falling, she stumbled down the treacherous path to the bottom. She wiped her tear-stained face with muddy hands and hurried to where Einar was waiting. Good, he told her. Now do it again. Each day through the summer, she ran the hill path. On fine days, the mist of the falls made rainbows, and she began to smile when she reached that place instead of weeping as she had the first time. It began to feel not easy, but doable. She began to come down grinning and proud. Einar grinned back at her. You're growing strong, he said, then added, for a girl. She glanced at him and saw that he was teasing her. His look was fond. He turned away quickly and tried to hide the fondness, but Claire knew. She had seen him look that way at a half-grown lamb prancing in the meadow on a midsummer afternoon, admiring its agile charm. She had seen him look that way at her, and knew there was a longing to his gaze. When she felt she had mastered the path, he made it harder. He tied her hands together so that she couldn't use them to steady herself. When the spring moisture had dried, the path became gritty and treacherous in a different way. She couldn't grip it with her toes. When she fell, bruising her shoulder because she couldn't break the fall with her tethered hands, he taunted her. When she wept, he ignored her. She dried her tears and ran. One afternoon, Breen, her baby in a sling on her chest, stopped by the hut to get a remedy for a spider bite on her ankle. Alice and Claire looked at the hot, swollen sore. Comfrey root oil, Alice told her. I have it here. Sit while I heat it. Breen handed little Ellen to Claire. I'll take her outside, Claire said, and she carried the sturdy, curly-headed girl to the dooryard to show her some black-eyed Susans in bloom. Einar appeared. He came every day now, if Claire didn't run to the sheep meadow and meet him there. It's Breen's baby, she told him. Isn't she sweet? She handed a picked flower to Ellen, who grasped it up in a fist and waved it in the air. Run with her, Einar said. Claire was startled, but she laughed. Then, holding the baby, she ran around the small dooryard. Ellen waved her arms in delight. Let me feel her weight. Einar took the baby from Claire. She could see that he had no experience with the human infant, though he was sure and facile with lambs. She watched as with his large hands under her, Einar assessed how heavy Ellen was. You must start running with weight, he said, and handed the baby back. I'll bring it tomorrow. The next day he was back with the crude leather sack half filled with rocks. He tied it to Claire's back and told her to run the hill path. She did so, and arrived panting at the waterfall. She was tempted to throw a few of the rocks into the rushing torrent to ease the burden, for she ran back down. But she didn't. She ran with the weight, and then ran the path again, and found that her breathing changed to accommodate the heaviness. After a few runs, the longer breath she needed came naturally, and it was as if she had always carried it. Alice told her that it was the way of women to tote a newborn and then adjust as it grew, until by the time the child was plump and heavy, the weight seemed naught. Einar left a pile of rocks beside the base of the path and told her to add one more to the sack each day. Her legs grew muscled and firm. She showed him, one day, how strong and sure they had become. He felt where she showed him, pressing his large hand against the taut, smooth skin above her ankle, and nodded. Then he left his hand there, encircling her leg, and they looked at each other for a moment before he took it away. She felt his fondness again, and her own for him, and the futility of it for them both. She could not stay here. One morning, Einar set a thick log on end. It reached to her knee. "Step on that," he said. She reached for his hand, needing it for support, but he backed away. Claire checked the log to be certain it was firm on the ground. Then she measured the height with her eyes, raised one leg up, placed it on the top of the log, shifted her weight, and picked up her other foot. But she lost her balance and fell back. Try again. All afternoon, she stepped onto and down from the log. At first, she held her arms wide, using them for balance. Then Einar approached with the coarse rope he had used to restrain her hands on the steep path. "Wait," she told him. "I don't need my arms tied." Firmly, she held her own hands at her sides. Wobbling at first, she tested herself again and again, until without moving her arms, she could maintain her balance as she mounted the log. "Good," he said. The next day, he brought it a higher, narrower log. Winter came. Outdoors, she ran and climbed on ice. He began to teach her to use a rope, to knot it and twirl it and fling it so that it caught on a rock or a branch. At first, it caught things at random. Then, after a bit, she found she could aim with the noose of the rope, that she could choose a log or a bush and catch it precisely on most of her attempts. Then he made the noose smaller. He directed her to capture smaller things. A seedling pine reaching upward from a crevice, a stone balanced on a tree stump. He took away the thick, coarse rope and gave her a thin woven cord that whistled when she spun it out into the cold air and snapped a twig with its tiny noose. Inside the hut, in a corner that Alice had cleared for her, she walked back and forth on a piece of rope stretched taut between two posts, her toes gripping the rope, her breath even, her eyes focused, her arms at first stretched for balance, and then, as spring approached, her hands at her side and her movement steady and controlled. She walked the rope forward and backward. She stood on it still as a post, on one leg, then the other. Slowly, she bent one knee, lowered herself, remained there poised, then rose again. Yellowwing tweetered and pranced on his perch, excited as he watched her. Alice, watching, held her breath and then gasped at each new move. But Claire was calm. She felt strong. She felt ready. "Now?" she asked Einar. Einar shook his head. "Next, we begin to strengthen your arms," he said. By the following spring, Bryn's baby, Ellen, was sturdy and walking. Bryn was expecting another and hoped for a boy. Bethan, Delwith, and Ira were tall now, with long legs and secrets that made them whisper and giggle. Most of the village had lost interest in Claire. She was no longer new and mysterious. The scandal of her child was forgotten. There had been more recent disgraces. A woman who took up with her sister's husband, a fisherman who was caught stealing from his own brother. The villagers took little note of Claire's odd new hobby. The hill paths were not visible, and Alice's hut was separate. She continued her everyday chores, helping with the gathering of plants, accompanying Alice to birth and death. Sometimes Alice sent her alone to tend a simple cough or fever or rash. The old woman was increasingly bent over, and her walking now was slow. Her eyesight was dimmed. She needed more rest. Claire teased her gently and told her that she should train to climb out. "Look how strong Einar has made me," she said, and held out her bare arm, tightening the muscles with pride. Each evening, after she had cleaned up the hut from dinner, and while Alice sat knitting in her rocker, Claire took up her position, lying on her side on a mat near the wall, and breathed deeply. Then, legs straight, she raised her body on one arm, held herself there, hovering, and then eased herself slowly down, again and again, first one arm, then the other. Her sack of rocks was so heavy now that an ordinary person groaned, trying to lift it, but for Claire it was easy. She swung it onto her back each day and wore it while she tended the garden or gathered the herbs. She ran up and down the hill path with the sack on her back and another in her arms. Steep, rutted places that had once made her stumble and slip were now familiar and easy. He had her run the path at night. Things felt different in the dark. She trained her feet and hands to know the shapes of things and her mind to sense when she neared an edge and must back away lest she fall. He wanted to blindfold her so that she could practice the dark in daytime, but she said no. I'll do it at night, even in the middle of the night, when there's no moon and when it's bitter cold. But I can't have something tied over my eyes. It's like being on the sea. It's a fearsome memory that I can't. She turned away and couldn't finish, but he seemed to understand. You must learn the dark, though, he told her. Part of the climbing out will be in dark. You start before the sun comes up. Why? It's too long a climb to do it all in daylight. If you wait and go at dawn, at sunup, then the dark part will come near the top. You'll be making your way up and around places where a mistake will bring death on you. I'll teach you to feel every bit with your feet, but even so, you'll need your eyes as you near the top. Together, they looked up at the shadowy cliff. Claire had to lean back to see the top. Mist swirled there, and she could see hawks circling. He had said he would teach her to feel with her feet, and after some time she became aware, amused by it, that even her toes were supple now. With astonishment, she realized that she could perceive the smallest of pebbles and pick them up, if need be, with individual toes. She could grasp a twig between the third and fourth toe of her left foot, or carefully feel her way around the sharp edge of a flat rock by her tight big toe, which was as sensitive now as a fingertip. She told this to Einar with delight. Imagine that, she said. Toes! He nodded in agreement, but looked sad. What's wrong? She asked him. But he turned away and didn't reply. Guiltily, she realized it had been cruel to be so gleeful over the strength and agility of her feet to someone who had lost his own. 11. Twins. 2 boys with bright red hair. Bryn, exhausted as she was, lay laughing at the surprise and the sight of them. Claire held one in each arm and then laughed herself as she realized she was raising and lowering them slightly, the same way Einar had her raise and lower heavy rocks to strengthen her forearms. It was almost winter again. She moved Yellow Wing's cage indoors. It had hung all summer and into autumn from a tree branch in the dooryard. Now in the warmth, he fluffed his wings and chirped. Bethan was there, and Ellen. Their mother needed quiet to tend her 2 new boys, and sent the girls off to amuse themselves. Now little Ellen, squatting on the floor, twisted twigs into a bird shape and pretended she had made a wife for Yellow Wing. Bethan was busily helping Alice sort some dried herbs to be packed into bags and stored. Claire, watching, realized that Alice was beginning to teach the young girl in the same way that she had taught Claire for these past years. The village would need someone to take Alice's place. It was clear that it could not be Claire. She wrapped her hands around the thick branch that Einar had peeled and set firmly in place above the door. She lifted herself up until her chin was level with the peeled wood. She hung poised there and counted to 10, then lowered herself slowly. Doing this still hurt. That meant she needed it. She must do this each day until it stopped hurting. Then, she knew, Einar would tell her to put on her backpack filled with rocks and begin doing it again. Briefly, on a day when she was exhausted, she thought of Einar with frustration, of how demanding he was, how relentlessly he made her do the exercise again and again. Then she thought of how he watched her, assessing and admiring her strength, and she knew that his gaze was also that of someone who loved her. Tall Andres had married in midsummer, his new wife a fresh-faced, quick-smiling young girl named Marin. Standing at the ceremony, Claire felt no sadness. She had never wanted to be his wife, but once he had hoped for it, and now he had moved on and seemed happy. She thought sadly of Einar, alone in his hillside hut, and knew that a part of life was passing both of them by. Soon, she asked Einar, after she showed him how she could hold herself raised on the branch with her arms taut and unshaking, even while wearing the sack of rocks at its heaviest. He ignored her question. "One arm now," he said. While he watched, she struggled to lift herself with just one. He wanted her arms to be equally strong on both sides, as her legs now were. On either leg, she couldn't hop up onto a rock slippery with damp moss and stand balanced there with the other tucked up like a water bird. After rain, she could slide, standing on one foot, down the steep muddy path and stop herself at any point by pressure on her heel or toes. She could hold the pebble on her raised foot and then move it by concentrating on it until it was between two toes, then under. From there, she could move it from toe to toe, under and over. It made little Ellen laugh uproariously to watch, and then try the same feat with her own chubby toes. "Why do I need to spend time learning foolish tricks?" Claire asked Einar. "This seems a waste." "It won't be. It's important. You'll see." She was eager to go. She had waited such a long time. But she had come to trust Einar, his wisdom and caring, deeply. So she sighed and nodded. In the winter, she slept beside Alice. When the fire died late one night, with wind howling outside, the old woman shivered, and Claire embraced her, trying to send warmth from her own body into the frail limbs that could no longer hold on to their own heat. "You're a good girl," Alice murmured. "Your own mom must miss you fierce." Claire was startled when she tried, in response to Alice's words, to think of her mother. There was little that came forth. Parents. Yes, she had had parents. She could remember their faces and could even recall the sound of their voices, but there was little else. "No," she told Alice. "I don't think she loved me." Alice turned in the bed, and through the dim light of the last embers that glowed in the fireplace, Claire could see her bright eyes open in surprise. "How could that be, child?" Claire chuckled and hugged her. "I'm not a child anymore, Alice. Maybe I was when you found me. I was a young girl then. But so much time has passed, Alice. I'm a woman now." "To me, you're a child still. And a mom always loves her child. It should be so, shouldn't it? But something stood in the way of it. I think it was, well, they call them pills. The mothers took pills." "Pills? Like a potion?" That was something Ellie understood. "But a potion is meant to fix an ill." Claire yawned. She was achy and exhausted. "My people." My people? What did that mean? She didn't really know. They thought that it fixed a lot of ills, not to have feelings like love. "Fools," Alice murmured. Now she yawned too. "You loved your boy, though. That's why you're soon to climb out." Claire closed her eyes and patted the old woman's back. "I did," she said. "I loved my boy. I still do." 12. In late spring, Tall Andres had a plump newborn son, and there were lambs prancing in the upper meadow, their soft fleece warm in the changed, gentler weather. Early wildflowers went in bloom, and lavender butterflies with lacy patterned wings darted from one to the next. Prince's twin boys grinned and showed 2 teeth apiece. The fishermen folded freshly knotted nets they had mended in winter, while their wives, beside them at the fire, made the sweaters they would wear on their boats. Even the wind seemed new. It wasn't the same brutal wind that had ripped the roof thatch and swirled the window. Now it pulled the warm scent of brine-washed sea urchins' mussels and kelp from the rocks and carried it gently across the beach and up the hill. It lifted Claire's long curls as she knelt and filled the basket with nettles. The rigid stems and heart-shaped leaves were covered with stiff hairs that were painful to touch, but she was wearing the special protective gloves Alice had made. The plant would be a valuable pain reliever for old Benedict, who was suffering from gout. "Don't touch," she warned Bethan, who had come with her and wanted to help. "It stings. You gather the elder bark over there. Your mom needs it for your brothers." Bethan peeled bits of the bark and added it to the basket. The twins were fussy from teething. "When I leave, you'll be in charge of the gathering then. Alice will make gloves for you. You must be careful with these nettles." Bethan hung her head. "Do you think you can't do it? You've learned so much," Claire reassured her. "I can do it, but I don't want you to leave." "Ah, Bethy," Claire hugged the slender girl. "You know why I must go." "To find your baby," Bethan sighed. "Yes, I know. Not a baby anymore. He's a boy now. If I don't go soon to find him, he'll be a man." "I fear for you, Claire." Bethan's voice was low. "Why's that? You know how strong I am. Look!" Claire reached out with one arm and grasped the limb of the elder tree. She raised herself until she balanced, unwavering, from the one muscled arm. Then slowly she lowered herself back to the ground. "Not even your pa can do that, can he?" Bethan smiled slightly. "No, and pa's getting fat too, Ma says. You mustn't fear for me then. You can see that I'm strong and swift and smart and sly and..." Bethan giggled. It was a game they often played with the sound of words. "And silly, and sleepy, and slug bucket, swat bottom." As it always did, their word game dissolved into nonsense, and they laughed as they carried the basket back down the hill. Time passed quickly now. The seasons flowed into one another, and Claire was no longer surprised as the changes came. Like the other villagers, she bundled herself against the increasing cold as each winter approached, and welcomed each new spring. The growth of the children made her aware of time passing. Bethan and her companions were no longer giggling, exuberant children. They were becoming taller, quieter, preparing for womanhood to come. Ellen, no longer a baby, was the small, mischievous one now, playing the imaginative games that her sister once had. The red-headed twin boys scuffled and scampered together, while Breen, their mother, fretted over their misbehavior and laughed at their antics. Each spring, the snow melted, and Claire took Yellowwing's cage outside to hang it once again from the tree. Each fall, when the wind swept it from the sea and the leaves fell rustling on the ground, she brought her little companion into the cottage once again. "How long will he leave?" she asked Einar one day when she was feeding the bird. Suddenly, she was aware that each leaf had a beginning and an end. Birds have a long life. He'll be here to keep Alice company when you be gone. Claire glanced at him. He had not mentioned it in a long time, the fact of her leaving. He tested her strength still and kept her working at it, but he had not spoken of the climbing out for many months. It had been 6 years now since the day she had been carried it from the sea, and 5 since the morning that Elena's birth returned the memory of her son to her. Somewhere he would be a half-grown boy, running, shouting, playing. Einar saw her questioning look. "Soon," he told her. With summer approaching, plants coming into flower, and Alice in need of more help as her strength began to ebb, there was a great deal to do. The daily exercise had long been part of Claire's routine. She rose before dawn each day and lifted sacks weighted with stones many times with each arm before she put the kettle over the fire. Then, while she waited for the water to boil for tea, she practiced the lifting of her legs and then raising of her upper body as she lay flat. She could now do these things with great ease. It made her laugh to remember how difficult they had been when she started. Now she tied heavy rocks to her ankles and wrists, but still performed the familiar motions without effort. She cleaned Yellow Wing's cage as she did each morning. It had been raining for some days, but now the rain seemed to have ended. It was a simple cloudy spring morning. She carried the cage outside and hung it from the willow tree beside the hut. She whistled and chirped back at the bird, who was excited at being outdoors. Then she heard the familiar answering whistle and turned to greet Einar, who was approaching from the meadow path. "Alice baked bread yesterday," she told him cheerfully, "and she made extra. We have a loaf ready for you." "Look at the sky," Einar said. She did. Above the looming cliff, the pale wetted clouds reminded her of Einar's ship when, after the snow melt, they still huddled for warmth, but with heads down moved across the meadow nibbling at new shoots. But somehow she knew that wasn't what he meant. What? There's sun behind. The rain's done for a while. Those who tended stock like Einar, or who farmed like Andres, or all of the village fishermen, they knew this guy. Claire nodded cheerfully at what he said. "Good. I can do the washing and hang it out on the bushes." "No," Einar said. "No more washing. It's time to climb out."